there are 20 times more men dying in the workplace than women. It's a pretty big difference. 20 men for every one woman.
But there is no such movement that I know of that currently exists that goes, let's figure out how to stop that.
At year 9, boys are about a year and a half behind the girls. Shouldn't we be putting in commensurate effort and concern for the boys? Because literacy is pretty fundamental to almost everything you do in your life. Things like kill all men.
Yeah.
Acceptable in conversation. We blame all men for the illegal and immoral acts of a tiny, tiny proportion. But then we have a blind spot for the small proportion of women who also commit exactly the same. It's about 1 in 9 of the deaths in the previous 12 months had been female, and they were pointing to this, but then they were completely ignoring the 8 in 9 that were male. Surely, if your life is completely extinguished, surely lives not count in Hillary Clinton's calculus, talking about how, women are the biggest victims of conflict, lose their homes and their partners and their sons. But what about the young men who got killed on the front lines?
Who cares about them?
Boys in Australia are 43% more likely to not complete high school than girls. It's in the tens of thousands of extra boys not finishing year 12 every year across the country. We have had this bias, this consistent systemic bias for several decades. The moral weight given to male lives is close to zero, but the moral weight that is given to female lives has a much, much larger weight in their moral reasoning. As a Christian, it's unfathomable that you would have no concern for males being killed. Public schools have, in some cases, put very young children on an escalator towards gender transition. How is that not conversion therapy? They can get double mastectomies, they can get gender transition and hormonal drugs that are off-label. They're not driving cars, they're not voting. What it's saying is what people have been thinking, but they've been too scared to say. The Relentless War on Masculinity by David Maywald in paperback, ebook and audiobook.
Good morning, David.
G'day, how are you, Emeka?
Well, thank you. Thanks for joining me on the show today. You're an author. You have recently written a book that became a best-selling book I believe it was on Amazon. And that happened really quickly. It's a super cool book, and I think it's a much-needed topic that you wrote on in our time, for our time. Very quickly, can you tell me what the name of that book is tell our audience what the name of that book is that you wrote?
Yeah, so this is the book, The Relentless War on Masculinity.
Yeah, it's very cool.
By
We'll
David
put it up
Maywald.
on the like a nice digital of it as well. Very cool. Yeah, let's dive into that.
Emeka Unscripted exists to ask the questions others won't, and to do it honestly. If this content educates, enlightens, or empowers you, consider supporting us on Patreon. Your support keeps these conversations independent, thoughtful, and alive.
Yeah, so this is, it tackles a controversial area of gender equality, and it specifically focuses on the disparities faced by boys and men and the harm that's been done to relationships between men and women, which obviously feeds into marriage, children, birth rate. It feeds into so many areas of our lives.
Yeah, and obviously, which is why I said before, it is a very relevant topic for today, because one of the points that you make in the book is that the start of the feminine rights movement that started, and you got, I don't quite remember the date, but you pinpoint it to a specific date that it started, and the 3 levels that it's gone through, and where it is at now. I think there's a 4th level. Correct me if I'm wrong.
That's right, yeah.
And each phase that it's gone through has morphed significantly, and things have shifted. And what we are seeing now in our society now, a lot of what is happening, a lot of the woke ideologies, the views, has actually all just come from that. It was the natural trajectory of that. How did you come up with that analysis? How did you get there to that point?
Well, it goes up to how I was raised. I mean, I was raised in a Christian family by parents who were really aware of social justice. And, back in the 80s when I was starting to go to school, and when I was being raised by my parents, I was really aware about feminism, about women's empowerment, about girls' education, about giving women equal rights in the workforce and opening up new areas for them. And Emeka, that sat with me for a long time. And I probably would have previously, quite a long time ago, I would have called myself a male feminist. But as I watched what was playing out, in education, for example, women overtook men at Australian universities in 1987. Now that's almost 40 years ago, right? And since that time, it's continued going only in one direction. And after I became a parent to a son and a daughter, it really made me think about this symmetry of how we treat males and females, about whether we're actually being true to equality and fairness. And what I did essentially was apply the same approaches of feminism and social justice, but apply them to boys and men in terms of understanding where the disparities are and how we could support the boys and men who've really fallen through the cracks in education and health, well-being, longevity, even in the workforce. For example, we talk about, women being oppressed, but there are 20 times more men dying in the workplace than women. That's a pretty big difference. 20 men for every one woman.
Yeah, but there is no such movement that I know of that currently exists that goes, let's figure out how to stop that. There's plenty of that for the women,
Yeah.
right? And you did a lot of deep research as you wrote, and I must encourage the audience. It is certainly a book worth reading, both for men and women too. It's quite eye-opening, because one of the things you did really quite well is that you went in and researched and found some of these specific numbers that clearly shows the disparity between the focus that we have on supporting women to the point where it's become actually quite unfair for men, right? Talk me through that process for you, and what were you feeling as you found, okay, because it goes from, I feel this might be happening, and then it's another thing to start doing the work to research and write about it, and determine, oh my goodness, it's not just what I think, it's probably worse than what I think. What was your experience through that?
So I had 20 years in financial services where I was doing research and analysis. So I actually had a really good grounding for both quantitative and qualitative analysis. And that followed writing a honours thesis at university. So, Emeka, I was pretty comfortable handling data, interpreting information, reading between the lines, and weighing up, the positives and the negatives. For example, when I had a chat with the principal at my kid's school, we talked about girls in STEM and about the pretty big efforts that there are to encourage more girls to go into science and mathematics and other topics like that. And at the same time, I raised the question about boys and literacy, because at year 9, boys are about a year and a half behind the girls in terms of literacy. So shouldn't we be putting in commensurate effort and concern and consideration for the boys? Because literacy is pretty fundamental to almost everything you do in your life. And, it caught our attention because we have had this bias, this consistent systemic bias for several decades now of being very alive to some things, but not alive to other things.
Yeah. And if you mentioned, your connection to social justice and your parents, that background that you have, that obviously turned your attention towards this. But I think in thinking about it, if you place this on a justice scale, right? Everybody can picture this as I talk about it. It's like justice scale, and you were like, there felt like there was an imbalance where, men got a lot of the benefits, they were in the workforce, they're this and that and everything else. And then you were like, over time, the feminist movement started, and it's like, well, let's correct that, and it's not great. And they started putting things on this side to try and even out the scale, and started coming back up. And just what happened was there was such a fixation on this And maybe it's just a societal thing. Maybe it's a pathological thing that is being explored by some evildoers. Maybe it's a combination of all. But the scale tipped. It went way past being balanced. And everywhere you look, and that's what your book really well articulates quite well, where it shifted that almost entirely. And now you even talk about the suicide rate for men, right? The sheer misproportion of that. And we're obviously not saying, women should be dying equally. But when you even talk about the media, the men in media versus women in media, and how there are movements about women should not be attacked in the media space. It's your book, you wrote that bit. So I want you to tell that particular story, because I found that really fascinating and how that has played out.
Yeah, well, the media has changed significantly. If you go back, say, 50 to 60 years, and what we've had is symptomatic of many other areas, for example, in education. If you go back to the start of the second wave of feminism, which is roughly the early 1960s, a number of sectors had women being underrepresented. It wasn't zero. I mean, it's not to say that we started from 0 women working in universities or working in media organizations. There were still voices there. In fact, there were quite strong voices in some cases. But as more women were being educated, coming into the workforce, as the double income became a standard for families and households to have, there was a shift in organizations. And I believe there's an inherent bias that all people have towards females. We cherish girls and women. We cherish that the unique ability to be the reproducers, to birth new life, and how valuable that is and how unique and critical that is to humanity. But what happened through that period was that innate bias got weaponized. Feminists and other activists for women's empowerment weaponized that bias. And instead of sending us towards a healthy balance or equality, they sent us way into overreach, away from balance.
Yeah. And like I said before, that balance is like almost celebrated. That imbalance, rather, it's rather celebrated. As I was saying, you made this commentary on something that happened specifically within that media space, how there became like a bit of a movement around, women not being attacked in the media space. But then talk us through that particular scenario that you described in the book.
Well, there's common observation that at the moment there's an emphasis on misogyny in the modern media, and that being blamed onto boys and men. But there's a big blind spot in terms of identifying misandry, which is the opposite of misogyny. We actually tolerate misandry quite regularly. For example,
well, it's not even a very well-known word. So, of course, we're just like, oh, yeah, that's happening. That's fine.
Yeah. I mean, literally things like kill all men being acceptable in conversation. We don't really push back on that, saying, what, you literally want to kill all men, or they're not worthy, or they've done something criminally wrong? We blame all men for the illegal and immoral acts of a tiny, tiny proportion. But then we have a blind spot for the small proportion of women who also commit exactly the same illegal and immoral acts. If you go back to 2000, there was an incredible book on misandry, which was written by Nathanson and Young. It was written in 2000. And what they'd done is looked at the media and entertainment landscape in the 1990s. And they came back with all of these examples of misandry, which is the hatred and contempt of men, which were being magnified through television programs and through films and through newspaper articles. And that's only got worse in the last 25 to 35 years. So think about a boy or a young man who's growing up, seeing thousands of messages and images and instances which denigrate his innate maleness and masculinity.
Yeah, and that has a very long-term impact, especially when they grow up and they have an inability to take their place as a man. I mean, if you even look at our country at the moment, Australia, so you're in Canberra, which is why we're having this conversation remotely, and our Prime Minister is a male, and the one before that has been a male, and there's been quite a few before that have been male, and they are so wishy-washy, flip-flop, don't know what they're doing, have no values, have no morals, have no standards. But you know who is in the public right now that seems to have more standards, more values, that is more centered? It's a woman. And I think it's interesting, right? What I think, you may or may not agree with me, but when I look at the likes of Albanese, our Prime Minister, I wouldn't call him a masculine man.
No.
At all. I wouldn't even know if I'll call him a feminine man, to be honest. But he's so emotional in his language. I mean, you see a lot of his recent interviews in him being asked questions, and he's so hyper emotional. He can't answer anything straight. He doesn't exude any level of, I know what I'm doing, I have authority, and I'm driving us as a nation somewhere. So that's a problem. The media thing I was talking about, sorry, you were going to make a commentary on that.
No, go on.
The media thing I was talking about that that really fascinated me, there were some numbers that you raised, and it was like 1 in every 9 women or 8 women I've been attacked in the media space. So something to do with that. Like when they in journalistic space, when they go out to report on something, there's an attack on them. But and it was like, okay, what's the men count? Because nobody's paying any attention to the men count for the exact same thing. And it was like, well, it's 7 in every 8 for men.
Yeah.
But like there's this big movement around all women should be protected from this.
Yeah.
You know what I'm talking about?
Yeah, that's right. That's an infamous tweet that was issued by UN Women, and it's about the targeting of female journalists, and it's like you said, it's about 1 in 9 of the deaths in the previous 12 months had been female, and they were pointing to this, but then they were completely ignoring the 8 in 9 that were male journalists who died. And this is the interesting thing about gynocentrism and gamma bias, which are two of the tactics that are used. The moral weight given to male lives is close to 0, but the moral weight that is given to girls or women or female lives has a much larger weight in their moral reasoning. This is what has really concerned, I think, a lot of thoughtful men and women of goodwill who are involved in this space, is why such a big double standard? How can you justify that? I mean, as a Christian, it's unfathomable that you would have no concern for males being killed, but then you would only ever talk about females being killed. So that is one of the, and another, infamous line was from Hillary Clinton going back a couple of decades at a conference, talking about how, women are the biggest victims of armed conflict, saying that they, lose their homes and their partners and their sons. Again, it puts virtually 0 moral weight on the men who've died during that conflict. Surely, as a primary victim or the person who suffers the most, if your life is completely extinguished, surely you count. Do those lives not count in Hillary Clinton's calculus?
Yeah.
Whereas the women who've been inconvenienced, in Ukraine, the poor women who have no partners, we have to think about the poor women who can't get married in Ukraine. Well, what about the young men who got killed on the front lines?
The one who used to be their partner.
No concern for them?
Who cares about them? They're a male and their life has been extinguished, so no one should really care. But this is why I love talking to people like you, because you're a critical thinker. That's quite a masculine trait that obviously very equally, to some respects, is shared by women as well. You're a critical thinker. And it seems to me one of the things that is really missing in our society now is critical thinking, right? Because we're like, well, sure. Somebody might explain that 1 in every 8 women that is, being targeted, and that's a problem because there are lesser women in the media space. So therefore, if that's the case, if there are lesser women and one in every 8 is targeted, so we should be concerned about that. So hence why there's more focus on that. One might think that that's the case, but the reality actually spells the opposite. Most of these fields, media, education, like some of these spaces, healthcare, they have been predominantly dominated by women now, right? So that disparity is even there. There are literally more women. And so if you can critically realize that fact, you can see it, right? You can probably find some data that analyzes it and goes, yeah, that's correct. Therefore, the given is that actually disparity is even worse, because if 7 in every 8 are being targeted that are men, then it's more because actually there are lesser men. And you have to go through the critical thinking of processing that in order to arrive at a point where you make a determination that this is really bad. So I don't know whether it is an intentional thing to keep on creating these narratives, because all it's doing is desecrating society even further. Is that a statement that you might agree with based on what you wrote about?
So there are innate differences in how males and females organise and communicate. And feminism did benefit from the different styles of communication and in-group bias and reinforcement between women, helping each other. And that's something that men need to really carefully think about, because we are less likely to turn up to events. We're less likely to ask for help and sometimes less likely to offer help. So in my opinion, it's fanciful to think that the men's movement will be similar to the way that feminism played out, because men and women cluster in so many areas where you typically have differences in behavior. That applies to psychology as well as physiology, hormones, and other things. So we need to think about what are the modes of engagement. And this is where the manosphere is quite so interesting and important for a lot of men. If most of your time is focused on your job or running your own business, like a tradie or someone else, a lot of the time is going to be away from home.
Yeah.
You might have a phone with you. So you have this digital connection. You're not catching up as much with your male friends. It's often not the case that guys have the coffees with each other, have the dinner, or go out of their way to organize chances to catch up. So to denigrate the manosphere and to uniformly try and dismiss all men who engage with each other online as misogynists and sexist, it's just blatant gaslighting, and it's actually really counterproductive, because that is actually a space that we know men are able to and willing to engage with each other. And I've seen a lot of healthy interaction where you've got men who've been through similar things, having mutual support, lifting each other up, where you've got older guys with experience offering it to younger guys. So I think we really need to push back. And as men, we need to take ownership of what masculinity means. We need to be more active in the public square instead of being pushed out of it.
Yeah. And I think part of what has happened is that I think men largely have gotten exhausted and tired of, it's like a fight they don't want to have. I mean, you see it, especially in the homes in Western culture, I see largely where, this saying, happy wife, happy life, and the woman has almost complete control of what's happening in the home, to the point where the man's like, well, it's easier for me to just let that happen. And that starts from the home, and it makes its way into society, into the larger scale and grander scale of everything. Now, it's not to say that as a man, being able to love your wife doesn't mean that you dominate and take control of everything and she doesn't have a say in anything. But there should be a clear differentiation of authority and who you are and what that stands for in the home. Because if we are unable to get that right even within the home setting, then that flows out into society, because it even flows out into the way our children see us being, as men, represented at home, right? Do you have any comments on that?
So there's a big pushback from large parts of the men's movement on happy wife, happy life. And, the reorientation is happy spouse, happy house, which in the sense takes away the sex, right? And it gives equal weighting and mutual respect to the man and to the woman. And what it says is you both have to take responsibility. You're both accountable. You're in this together. Help each other. Don't cut each other down. It's really interesting, Emeka. I'd never thought of that happy wife, happy life is the parallel of gynocentrism at a social level.
Yes.
So what gynocentrism is prioritizing the interests and preferences and traits of females well above the same of males. So it's essentially doing that at the societal level.
Yeah. Well, your book has inspired that thought in me, by the way. So it's a well worth read. It absolutely flows on. And inevitably what it does is it makes the leadership in society become more and more feminine in their behaviors, in the way they lead. And I, frankly, I mean, the Bible says it. That's why the man has a different role in the household to what a woman does. And part of the man's role is to be a protector, right? And there is a strength and authority and power that comes with being a protector. I mean, you don't protect if you're weak, right? And there's a reason for that, right? If the woman had the strength to be the protector, then she'll be called to be the protector. But no, the man is called to be that. And we're called to guide and lead in our home. And so if they're unable to do that well within that setting, you see that in modern day leadership. They don't know how to do that. They make decisions, they actualize things that are just frankly weak.
I think the big problem that we've hit is assuming that males and females are androgynous is really dangerous approach for relationships and for society. I grew up and experienced that and saw that in early parenting. I've seen a lot of the discussions about social constructivism, which is the idea that, boys and girls get biased by what they see, the role models and the behavior they see around them. I think what's really amazing about the Bible and Christian teaching is that it honors the complementarity between men and women. It honors both the female, the male. It honors femininity. It honors masculinity. And the conception of masculinity in Jesus Christ himself as a role model, it's super powerful. Like, he was a servant leader. He clearly had incredible strength at the same time as having incredible compassion. And it was the ability in his story to modulate those and use those at the appropriate time with the judgment and the subjectivity, which is the role model I think we need to be speaking to boys and young men. I mean, this is an epitome, this is an ideal that none of us will ever reach in our earthly lives.
But we strive to perfection, right?
Yeah, we strive to that. And it's important to have that as a vision. The modern definitions of masculinity and traditional masculinity, I think most of them are straw men, and most of them have been deliberately created to undermine men. So that they create this fake straw man. They pick out all of the worst pieces they can find from male behavior. And they say, this is traditional masculinity. All these terrible things about dominating and aggressing and all these other things. They say, traditional masculinity is so flawed. You have to ditch all of that stuff. And this is where you get to the leaders. And I'd say this about leaders on both sides of politics is they've tended to mostly channel unhealthy aspects of masculinity, and they haven't exercised the full range of what it means to be a mature man, or to have real manhood, and to exercise that modulation of masculinity. And I think it is interesting that you point out that it's Pauline Hanson on the national stage who's been most empathetic to male disparity. She's certainly been a champion of addressing male suicide for a number of years. And it's also interesting that, at the national level, Bettina Arndt has such an ardent following because she's been bold and courageous in staring down feminists, and she's attracted tens of thousands of men who loyally follow her. They haven't seen that in other people, and it's missing. Where are the proud Australian male leaders who speak up for boys and men? Where are they?
Yeah. They're too busy coming up with insane ideas of how to do things. And like you said, they're channeling, well, things that just don't make any sense, to be honest with you. And a lot of the trait that you see in these women that are standing up, quite honestly and genuinely, they are masculine traits. But what it actually means, from my view, is that it's been missing now for long enough that somebody needed to rise, and women are certainly seeing, well, it has to happen, so they're rising, right? The space has been created long enough. I'm about to make a comment that somebody might call feminist and whatever else, but they don't really care. This is my show, go to yours. And it's that I think that's fine, and it's happened because it is missing. That's why people like Paul and Hansen and some of the names that you've mentioned there have risen to the occasion. But the reality is the temperaments that we were created with allows that trait to be sustainable within us, right? And what I genuinely believe, I believe you will have strong-willed women that are also just generally strong, that will have the shared determination to persist and achieve something that society needs a masculine leader to achieve. But I think the way it was ultimately created, the way we were created foundationally, is that trait sustains better within a man, and it's designed for it to be that way. And so I think these people, let's look Paul and Hansen on that stage, for example, that's why I'm kind of an advocate for her. And I made a statement the other day to make sure it's really clear that I'm not a supporter at this stage of my life of any one political party. Don't care. What I care about is whomever is part of whatever group that they're part of that has made a clear decision that they must draw a line and differentiate between right and wrong, what makes sense, and what ultimately furthers the sustainability of the human race at large. It's starting from the micro to the macro. Within that space, in the spectrum, that's who I will put my support to. That's who I will stand with. It's not about that party. And I'm reminded of something that recently happened with my platform. I've had a lot of people send me messages, and they get quite, all sorts of opinions, as you can imagine. And I've seen opinions that I see when females send me messages on their stance on whatever the topic of matter might be, it's very emotional usually. And if I challenge it, it ends in an accusation of like, well, you toxic masculinity or any of that sort of ideology. And what it means is that I have to choose to back down. They often don't engage meaningfully so we can deconstruct their arguments, and if they have a position, they can stand firm on it. Whereas it's interesting that even though men are not standing up as they should, and that's what this movement is about, David, that you're constructing within this book. I see that when men engage with me in conversations and they challenge an idea that I have, I find, and I'm putting this together with the point that we actually made to sustain that public space of leadership, I see that the men, more often than not, like 99% of the time, remain in the conversation, continue to argue their point. They might change some, they might improve on their knowledge, they might regress and change their mindset and understanding, but they sustain through the conversation. Even if we started on completely different sides of the conversation, they're less likely to throw the towel and be like, accusation, 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 you don't care anymore, you're wrong, I'm walking. Right? They're less likely to stay and argue until one of us gives in and say, well, okay, I consider logic here, consider pattern, you must be right. And I think your book, to some respect, articulates that as well.
Yeah, this lack of ability to have a civil conversation, it's a big problem, both, as you say, in organizations, but as well in personal relationships, because if people can't communicate with each other and share and agree to disagree, then it really makes it hard to communicate and to work together. I think there are, commentators now and authors who are talking about this. You look at Helen Andrews' essay on the Great Feminization and the way that organizations can shift when they have a majority female employees is interesting. And the cancel culture in academia has been really terrible for the quality of research and for the engagement with thoughtful students. But also, a lot of men have self-censored, right? So 2 to 3 years ago, when I was having coffee with lots of men and women, we'd have fantastic conversations. I'd chat with mums about their sons and daughters. They'd be able to share. And the guys I met could share their thoughts and feelings. But most of those people would never have said the same things up on stage or behind a microphone or a comment on LinkedIn because they were concerned about, as you say, one aspect is the name calling and the labeling. But the other thing is the cancellation and their job being threatened, their clients being threatened. The really quite vicious tactics that were being used to try and censor and keep men in line. We can't have a strong man. We can't have a strong father. And you also saw this in terms of the intolerance of Christians, which is
Yes.
bizarre in the Anglo and Western countries to denigrate Christians in Australia, the UK, the US, in Canada. You were actually being piled on for your faith in countries that, they said they were religiously tolerant, but they were uniquely intolerant of Christianity.
Which is weird, right? Because as far as I can see, and this is where, you talk about from a Christian perspective, we're wrestling also against flesh and blood. Because you can see that everything that is right has become wrong and everything that is wrong has become right. You have all these other belief systems that are not just being tolerated, they're being championed, celebrated, and when acts of atrocities are committed by virtue of some of the belief systems that are held within the larger belief system, our leaders are so weak they can't even say, well, that's wrong. But hey, man, imagine like a pastor in Melbourne lays hands on a gay child and cast a demon out. And they might end up in prison for 5 years, not too later after that. Right? I'm surprised that Christianity hasn't been labeled the religion of toxic masculinity by now.
Well, there are illusions, aren't there? But at the same time, public schools have, in some cases, put very young children on an escalator towards gender transition. So how is that not conversion therapy? How is that a healthy exposure and encouragement for lifelong changes, possibly becoming infertile? That's really tragic. It's interesting to see a case, I think it's in the US, one for a detransitioner, $2 million settlement quite recently.
Yes.
And I think we'll see plenty more.
It's a win for humanity, for sanity, actually, which would be...
How can you make a decision on that and informed consent
at 16
when young people aren't, they're not getting tattoos, they're not driving cars, they're not voting, but they can get double mastectomies, they can get gender transition and hormonal drugs that are off label. Yeah, it's bizarre that that's not called conversion therapy.
Yeah. So everything that's become wrong is now right, and everything that's right is now wrong. Sad day and sad reality. But I think the point that your book makes is that a lot of where things are now started from the feminist movement, and it escalated its way to where we're at now. And I'm sure that you've heard those. I don't know if you've had any people who have read the books and disagreed. This ought to be interesting. Have you had any? That guy's here. You're wrong, David. You're wrong.
Absolutely. Yeah. There's been some pushback.
What's the argument?
It generally comes from younger women who are leftist and feminists, and they're running classic lines around patriarchy and oppression, and they're talking about violence against females. But again, they have complete blinkers to, 3 or 4 men dying to suicide for every 1 woman dying to suicide. They seem completely disinterested in men dying 5 years younger They seem disinterested in a whole range of areas which are pretty fundamental to quality of life and existence. They've got very strong blinkers, and they overweight a narrow set of information,
Yeah.
and they dismiss or discredit whole other swathes of information.
Isn't that bizarre though? So I think we'll keep seeing that as your book makes the point, and you made the point before, that it's not just, I guess, it's not just about advocating for it, which we are on the journey of doing now, but there needs to be an inspiration that is on the onset set out by men that realize that there is a huge gap, and that gap is a disadvantage to all of us, and we need to start rising, teaching, training, educating our young ones. Thankfully, we both have boys, so at the very least, we can replace ourselves with the mission. But that needs to overspill into homes and guys that are even our age, that they need to become champions again of what it means to be a masculine man.
Yeah.
And not back away or back down because that's what society has now rearranged itself to become, because ultimately that's not serving society in any way.
So men aren't just providers and protectors. An essential part of masculinity is that we are builders and that we sustain community. You know, if you go right back to David Gilmour, Manhood in the Making, which was written in about 1990, he talks about how the threshold of going from a boy to a man is when you start producing more than you consume. So in sense that you're making more food or you're making more valuable products and services than what you're consuming yourself. And think of what that means. As a boy, you're actually taking from the family, from your community. You know, your family's investing in you and they believe in you, and it's an essential part of this unbroken line of humanity. But the threshold, which is a bit uncomfortable, right? Like if you want to be childish and selfish, you might want to stay a boy.
Yeah.
And this is why in traditional societies, the loving elder men sometimes had to go to physically cleave the boy from his mother. He wanted the comfort and that sort of safety and that ease.
To continue to take.
Yeah. And he didn't want to go through adolescence. And the loving elder men, including his father, maybe uncles and others in that community, they understood the importance of the initiation, the rites of passage for young men. And they also understood that it was super daunting and uncomfortable, and it was facing up to a reality that they needed to provide more broadly. So now there's a big emphasis and an obligation, I think, on men. We have to step up. We've got to be the builders who have a longer term vision than consuming today for selfish reasons.
Yeah.
We have to build the society that has healthy relationships between males and females, that has opportunities for both boys and girls, where everyone can be lifted up and cherished.
Yeah. I really like that a demarcation of being a man is the day that you're ultimately producing more than you're consuming. And I think what you articulated there in your thread, as I heard it, is that ultimately it's not just when you are producing more than you're consuming, but when there is a future aspiration towards that production, right? So that you are not just looking at feeding people for today, you're looking at what sustains for tomorrow and into the next day. And dare I say, even beyond me as an individual. Yeah. So if a man really wants to know, am I stepping up to be a man? Am I being a masculine man? Whatever that means for me, that actually looks like I am producing more than I'm consuming. And there is a long-term vision to my production that sustains beyond me. Therefore, I must create my world that is centered around that fact.
So in the past, men were building physical structures or producing food, or they had very tangible outputs. So they might have planted a forest, that would either bear timber or fruit or some other crop of value for their community. Now we have to really, comprehend what it means to build in a modern service-based economy. What's the social infrastructure that we need to build? I mean, part of this is healthier relationships between men and women. Part of this is around educational opportunities for all children and young people. It's not just accepting that girls will be good at literacy and there'll be, twice as many girls going through uni as boys and young women and young men. We need to work out what is it that we are building that is needed for our future society, that our children will rely on, that's healthy for social outcomes.
Yeah. And right now, if we had to kind of define that a little bit, I think it will be that a corporation of us that realize that society is kind of heading in the wrong direction. We've identified some of the whys, but we know that we have to unify to break down what it is that is currently happening. A lot of these woke ideologies that have centered into our existence, I think, has to start with men taking that authority in the home and them doing everything that means to be a protector and a provider. And women, the way we get that balance is that women agreeing, yeah, you're correct. We have roles and we have responsibilities that are equal, and we take that they're different. We don't stamp on each other, and that all flows into society that we actually become louder and stronger about dealing with the issues of today. So let me give you like a really basic example of that. So my son comes home and he says, "Dad, at school today, I'm being taught I can be a girl if I want to be. I can talk to the teachers and somebody at school about that." Okay, so on and so forth. And I hear that and I go, "Son, no, you can't be a girl if you want to be, because you're a boy. A boy becomes a man. And that's the trajectory that is for you, none other." And I don't just stop there. There's a bit of conversation there, but I go to the school and I make it clear that you may do this kind of brainwashing nonsense that you want to do and try to corrode young minds with what is not reality, but you cannot do that to my child. I will not allow it. It will not happen. And if it continues, I will do something about it. I will bring something that means that I am asking you to stop. I will do something about it. Now, imagine there is a critical mass of men that's what it means. This is what it looks like to take authority, right? Imagine there's a critical mass of men, which means there's a critical mass of families that go to school, my son's school, and they all say that. Let's say there's 30 people in the class and 25 go and say, "No, you will not do that. We do not stand for that, because that is rubbish. That is not how things function, and we will not allow it. It's biologically impossible. It's stupid." And watch what happens. So, okay, that's an example of what that could look like when we take authority and start to corporately make the attempt to return society back to where it needs to be.
I'll give you another couple of examples. One's very closely related to that, Emeka, which is the drift of parents and families from public education to religious, Catholic, Anglican, independent schools.
Yeah.
I've seen that. It's been happening in the data for quite a long time now. There is an important anchoring of values, tradition connected to religious beliefs. The other example I wanted to mention was the number of young men who've been turning up at Christian churches right across the English-speaking and the Western countries. I see it in the churches that I go to. I hear about it from many people. It's visible in some of the numbers. There's some amazing survey data coming out of the UK and other places. And my sense is after COVID, when we were quite disconnected and we followed, the expert advice, and we subjected ourselves to some really amazing restrictions.
I didn't. I refused to, just for the record. I refused all of it.
But my point is, after having gone there for a lot of people and a lot of families, after having been there, I think there's a bit of a counter response to that, which is we need real in-person relationships. We need some anchoring and quality in our spiritual life. It's not just about your finances, it's not just about your career or your job. What's the purpose and the meaning that gives you sustenance through your whole life? And particularly for young men, because education systems have been so feminized and so favorable towards girls and young women, I think a lot of boys and young men are feeling that they've not just been ignored or left behind, but a lot of them feel that they've been overtly discriminated against, that the opportunities have been hoarded, not for them, that they have to work twice as hard just to get to similar positions. And sometimes there are no roles available for men. The law gets used, the special measures in the discrimination law gets used to hire women in teams that are already unanimously or majority female. And that's not a temporary measure anymore. That's become a permanent measure.
I mean, the Air Force did it when I was in I think it was 2013. They made a decision and it was the defense minister, who I believe was female at the time, and made a decision that the Air Force had to, she gets from there, I think it was like 2026, it had to become something like 50% female. No, I don't get those numbers right. I don't claim to, but it was rather preposterous, right? Because I remember thinking, okay, what's the military about? What's the defense force about? It's about serving the nation, and to serve the nation in a particular way that protects its interest, right? Now, I get that there are definitely roles that women can do and do better than men in that space. But when you make a blanket rule like that, what you're saying is you want females in spaces even if it's unsuitable to them, right? That's what she was effectively declaring. And so in order for the Air Force to achieve that, in fact, it was the whole military, they had to lower the standards of entry so that can happen, right? And well, it was remarkable to watch that happen. But the funny part of that is that even though the standard was lowered, as the females came in, they quickly fell out. They were falling out quicker than what men. So the average lifespan of a man in the Air Force is like 7 years, right? But a woman wanted to be done by 3. Right? Well, that statistics kind of started growing. They always had female. Like you said, it didn't start from 0. There were always female in it, but then you put this bizarre rule in, so they have to pull in and attract more female, however they do that. But those female would come in that would have naturally never wanted to do that kind of thing anyway, and they're like, oh, this is not for me. So they fell out.
So let's look at the double standard for that. In psychology and in primary school teaching, it's 80% female. Where are the programs and scholarships and encouragement to get to 50-50? Because it's clear that that's not achieving gender equality. And those are two areas that are even more important than the Air Force, because half of the students are male. Do you not care about the boys in school? What about the patients? Because a lot of men are being very poorly served by psychology and other therapies because they've been designed around female traits and biases, and actually those forms of engagement, it doesn't click for a lot of males. So in areas that are really important about serving and delivering frontline to males, we just don't care, and we've let them become more and more feminized over time.
I want to finish with this. There's 2 kind of questions I do want to ask. So when I was in the Air Force, I took up a secondary position as a youth pastor, and I used to go into schools and minister to the young people. And what that just looks like was I put on programs, I brought food, I brought fresh fruit, I partnered with the local food banks, and I brought a lot of fresh fruit into the school, a lot of kind of things that they can consume and healthy things that, especially with kids who are not as privileged to in homes that provided those things. Now, I attracted a lot of young people, and part of that was that I spoke boldly and proudly and loudly about Jesus, and that I'm a follower of Christ. And what that means, I invited them to youth group and etc. And, that was a really special time, and it really worked. But there was this one time I witnessed something very interesting, right? I saw a female teacher who, there was a young boy who she was asking to do something or not do something. Now, I don't particularly remember it, but I tend to remember the feelings associated with the events. And I heard her at one point, she screamed at him, right? She said, something along the lines of, you will do what I say, I am the teacher, and you are just the child. Do what I say right now, or I'm writing you up. You'll not be coming back to this school. And I thought, wowzers. First of all, you're a professional, way too much emotion there, right? Compose yourself, mate. Secondly, I don't think that child is ever going to respond to that. What, you're going to assert your authority by, I'm a man? You see, I carried a lot of favors with the young people because even when they did the wrong things, that yelling at the child, that asserting that authority through volume and aggression maybe works when they're younger, a lot younger, but at that age, I mean, you're talking like a grade 9, grade 10 child, right?
Yeah.
And at that age, all you're showing them is that you're putting them in this mode to compete with you, right? And I thought that's not effective in any way. I felt out of that moment as well, I was like, well, how many times, because that school was predominantly female teachers, and I thought, how many times have the teachers felt the need to speak to that child that way? And what is being created in that child's mind when he's being dominated in that sort of context? Well, there's a few ways that he will become eventually. He will think that that's normal behavior and he will start asserting that everywhere he goes, right? Or that will completely demasculate him and dull him down, right? And the story you told brought that story to my mind, and I thought, yeah, society is bizarre, isn't it? And this was as far back as, like, I say 7 years ago or something like that. But that's still happening.
Are the quality of our relationships, children's life outcomes, families, are they better? I think we've been measuring the wrong things. And unfortunately, because it's easy to measure income and tax and GDP, because the financial metrics, it's easy to measure them. Unfortunately, we've managed and we've aspired to grow the things that are easy to measure. But in terms of what's important for children, it's the quality of life. It's like, GDP could be 10% higher or lower, but actually they could have a better life with a lower GDP where maybe their parents aren't working as much. Maybe there's actually better relationships and communication and quality family time. Emeka Conversations talks a lot about the first 3 years being crucially important for the attachment between the mother and the child. And that's a powerful statement because it's the opposite of the childcare culture that has been somewhat pushed onto parents of young children for a number of decades now. The childcare subsidy, it's available just to organised institutional care. You can't take the childcare subsidy if a mother stays at home or if you're the grandmother or a nanny or anything else. So actually the highest quality of care being the mother and the child, that does not get subsidised. What gets subsidised is the wages of childcare staff.
Which is actually the lowest quality of care.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it depends because in some families that are socioeconomically stressed or disadvantaged, there can be a benefit. For middle class and upper middle class families, there's no benefit of childcare for their children. So, and actually, in many ways, those children could be much better off. And the families might have a lot less stress and also have a lot more quality time if we were more focused on the things that really matter. And I think it's a powerful observation about what you've seen in class, because what comes through in the stats is that boys in school are much more likely to be suspended and expelled, are much less likely to complete high school. For example, boys in Australia are 43% more likely to not complete high school than girls.
Well, that's evident.
It's a big gap.
Yeah, huge gap.
We're not talking a small gap. That's just the gap itself. It's in the tens of thousands of extra boys not finishing year 12 every year across the country. So it's a very substantial number of boys and families and parents and communities that are being impacted by that. I think we need to have a narrative here that talks about the benefits for people. So, for example, about early early education and care, what I'd emphasize there is the benefits for the child of having a strong attachment to the mother, and the benefits for the mother of having the time to have a strong attachment, the benefits for the family, for the couple and their relationship. That's what we're not really capturing at the moment. In the school environment, it's interesting. I hosted a roundtable on boys' education a few months ago, and we talked about the benefits of boys being more engaged in class. And it's not just for the boys. The benefits are for the girls in the classroom. The benefits are for the teachers and the parents and the school community. So we need to turn this narrative around to find how lifting up families, boys, girls, men, women, and thinking about it in a holistic way delivers benefits for people.
Yeah, well, I will comment that certainly it seems to me that part of the reason that society's been positioned that way, which is part of that fight that we need to have, is that childcare has been subsidized at the rate it is because it pushes mothers, both parents, to go back to work, to be at work, and ultimately that raises more taxes for the government. And so the amount that they're subsidizing, when you look at the amount of tax that they're taking, well, it's like a small fraction of it. So it makes sense for them to subsidize that and send them back to work. So there's more tax being flowing through the economy, which is fundamentally another really, really bad way of really running a country, especially one that is so rich in natural resources that we shouldn't even have taxations nowhere near the level that we do. But we do, story for another day. But I think the final comment or question I wanted to ask was your book is fascinating and it made it to the top sellers list very quickly. I thought that was really cool. What's the secret ingredient? Is it that it was a relevant topic? What do you believe that it was that led to that success for you?
I just go back to the conversations that I was having with men and women 2 or 3 years ago. Hundreds of conversations there where they were sharing their real thoughts and their unfiltered feelings. That's what gave me the conviction to write the book. And I knew that it would connect with many people because what it's saying is what people have been thinking, but they've been too scared to say for several years. And I think that's why it's got a really good reception. And it does touch on many different parts of our lives, right? On parenting, it touches on to social policy, it touches on health and education and other areas. So, for anyone who's interested, please do look it up. Yeah. The Relentless War on Masculinity by David Maywald in paperback, ebook and audiobook. And please, share your feedback and your thoughts and reach out to me. I'd love to hear from you.
The book link will be in the description. We'll make it available there. And as we do consequent posts as well, we'll make it available. So if anybody's watching this and you're keen on the book, I think definitely we want to drive people's attention to it because I think it's inspiring for, I think just a sheer number of, and true to your background in that analytics space, you've been able to bring in all the data effectively so that people are able to see it. And I love that you actually reference the data's back to the point of origin, but so that people are able to quickly see that some of these feelings that we have, some of these things that we don't have language to, they're real. They're not just feelings. They're real things that is backed by real data that somebody's taking the time to do. And you've pulled that all together into one space, which is, and you've done that eloquently. And I really appreciate that fact, which is why I want to talk to you today. I think I would love to have another conversation with you in the near future. And I would love to dig into your leadership and business expertise, because that's another incredible side of you, which is obviously inspirational, which is, it's you can see it that the person who wrote that book has a lot of time and experience and life behind them. So I think it'd be really cool for some of my guests to get some insights and knowledge and deeper understanding in that world. But it's been certainly a pleasure having you on the show and chatting to you about the book and some of the concepts and not so theories and actualities behind the book. So do you have any final comments for the audience?
No, thanks so much for your time. Bless you and your family, Emeka, and the important work that you're doing.
Thank you. Thank you for your work too on the book and otherwise. So it's been a pleasure having you, David. We'll see you for another conversation soon, I'm sure. Take care.